an inside look at the difficulties, complexities, and challenges of investigating and arresting a serial killer that plagued a city for years, shooting 30 people and killing at least 4. Welcome to the Law Enforcement Today radio show. I'm your host. My name's John J. Wiley. In addition to being a radio broadcaster, I'm a retired police sergeant. For the latest news articles and much more, check out our website, letradioshow.com. In the Law Enforcement Today show, we'll be joined by special guests. We'll be talking about their experiences and issues affecting law enforcement officers, first responders, their families, their community, and victims of horrendous crimes. Be sure to like us on Facebook. Our page is Law Enforcement Today Radio Show. Check out the daily articles on our website, letradioshow.com. And while you're there, download our free app. The place to be online is our Facebook page. Do a search on Facebook for Law Enforcement Today Radio Show. You'll get access to unique news articles, editorials, and so much more. That's Law Enforcement Today Radio Show on Facebook. Calling us from Ohio, retired Police Lieutenant Dan Baker on the phone. Dan, thanks so much for joining us on Law Enforcement Today Show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
It is a pleasure. Exciting story. For those obviously, you don't know Dan. You're just introduced to him the first time right now. He's a retired police lieutenant from Dayton, Ohio Police Department. Remember a few weeks ago we had Doyle Burke on? Well, he had the pleasure of being his supervisor way back in the day. And I think Dan said something in an email that Doyle may have given him a gray hair or two way back in the day.
He certainly did, and I imagine I wasn't the only guy that he terrorized. Yes, that's right.
I had a couple sergeants, God bless them, that when I was a rookie police, before you know what's going on, and you're just so full of energy and vigor and everything else and messing up left and right. By the way, I say that, I'm talking about making mistakes, doing your job. We're not talking about corruption or stuff like that.
No,
that's not tolerated at all. And I'm sure I gave them more than a gray hair or two. Before we get into the conversation, since you retired, you've also written a book. What's the name of that book?
It's called Blood in the Streets, Racism, Riots, and Murders in the Heartland of America. And the book deals with the most violent period in urban American history from 1965 to 1975. And Dayton, being a medium-sized city, was certainly caught up in that in terrible ways that have dramatically affected the city and our population even till today.
Yeah, these scars don't go away. Not even, some say overnight, but not in a year, 2 years, 10 years, 20, 30 years. They take a couple generations oftentimes to disappear.
Yes, not only was it violent because we had 4 riots in 3 years, and the first riot required a 1,000 National Guard, which in 1966 was neither the police or the National Guard were prepared or trained for what we faced. But later on in the story we tell, which continued in Dayton in the 70s, was a serial killer that hated the forced busing of school children as part of a federal school desegregation order. And, of course, that's back in the news now today because of all the politics. But this particular individual then added to the problems of that 10-year period that I mentioned, because he became a lone wolf killer and shot over 30 black men at random on the street after midnight for over 4 summits before he was finally apprehended.
And they called him, I believe, the Midnight Slayer.
Right. He picked up the moniker pretty quickly from the low-key news media. And of course, we were without all the stuff we have today, so that he got the nickname pretty quick. And he wreaked terror on the city. At the same time, when our homicide rate for a city our size of 270,000 at that time was running well over 100 murders a year. And it just all that violence compounded with the dissension associated with the riots and the desegregation of public schools was fertile ground for a person who hated desegregation.
The name of the book is Blood in the Streets. Where can people buy it and get more information about it?
Well, it's in bookstores pretty much everywhere, but the easy places usually are the Amazon and any other online outlet, Amazon.com. And I also have a website. Perhaps you'll be able to post that, but at that website, they can actually hear the confession of this particular killer. I had that. My wife and I wrote this book and published it in 2014 because we both grew up in the city of Dayton. She's an African American female, and of course we didn't know each other back in the days of the '60s. But she was actually living on the segregated west side, where most of the black population lives. And she saw what went on with the police and the community in a different perspective as me, being a young white 22 or 23-year-old cop, pretty naive at the time, involved in totally unprepared response to the riots and troubles that went on in the 60s.
We're talking about the 60s, and part of me wants to go, that was so long ago. But the truth is, I was a little boy when I remember they started the desegregation and the busing, and I remember the upheaval about it. I didn't quite understand because I was just a little bit too young. And people might think, well, this is ancient history. Well, the truth is, it's not. And a lot of what we're going to talk about, the racial unrest, the violence that occurred as a result of all that, is still going on today. And part of me says we've come a long way. We've accomplished a lot of things. We're not the same country we were back then, obviously, but we're still dealing with a lot of same issues, or at least I'm hearing about them all the time.
Yeah, it seems to be a hot topic right now because of renewed conversations. There's still an awful lot of misunderstanding about it, though, because all desegregation efforts weren't the same. For example, you take a city like Dayton, of 270,000 people, 200,000 were white race mostly, and 70,000 were black, who were segregated on Dayton's west side. And to make matters worse, it was a physical separation. There was two rivers that run through the middle of the city, separated by with 13 bridges. And so even going to the west side was sort of a ultra negative sort of a situation for many whites. So, but the desegregation plan in Dayton involved one school district, not a region of school districts, and it just made the matter even worse because it literally pit black and white against each other. Those who hated it, for example.
And this is where it strikes me as odd. And again, I said I was a little boy when it occurred. I grew up in a military family, and I grew up mostly all over the place, but most of my childhood was spent in Norfolk, Virginia, and everybody was military I knew. And we had people from all races, all walks of life, all ethnicities, all religious backgrounds, and none of this made sense to me. Back then, it certainly didn't, and to be honest with you, today it still doesn't.
It is frustrating, isn't it? And since all the troubles in the 60s and the serial killer and all those related events through the 70s and desegregation, the city's population has actually gone down from 270,000 to 140,000.
Yeah, that's similar to Baltimore. When I was a rookie police in Baltimore, we were right around 1 million people. Last I heard, that was like 1980, and last I heard now there are about 670,000 people, but the total number of murders don't change.
Right. Well, one of the things that hurt Dayton so much was the white flight right away, because since it was the city of Dayton public schools only involved in the segregation, whites that chose to or were able to fled the city during the whole desegregation time, and then as the violence increased with homicides and the Midnight Slayer, fear was just rampant in the city, and people just booked out of there because it caused what white flight really stripped the city of an awful lot. And then on top of that, then you had all the economic fallout that came with it when people left, and there was redlining on home loans and all the things that go with segregated activity.
One of the things you brought up, the media is great at giving serial killers nicknames. They don't do it the same degree with everyday violent people, especially when you have like a hitman for a drug organization that's been linked with 10 or 15 murders. You can't prove them most of the time. You do your best, but they don't give them nicknames. But they're really good at coming up with really jazzy, almost overly romanticized, sexy nicknames like Midnight Slayer. And these people oftentimes are nowhere near as exciting as the nicknames are given, are they?
No, he absolutely was unexciting. And if you listen to the confession on the website, people will hear his monotone, flat, dull voice. He was an absolutely plain milquetoast sort of a guy, but he was clearly obsessed with the issue of the busing because one of his children had been harassed at school, and he just absolutely exploded over that matter and began it within a week.
One of the things I do know, and I'm not an expert, I've never worked homicide. I've worked in many homicides. I've never assigned a homicide unit. There are murders that you would say, okay, I can kind of understand why someone would snap. I can understand someone had bad 5 minutes of their life, overreacted. I'm not saying it's okay, but there are other ones you go, that's just baffling. And then when you talk about these serial killers, and I see all these investigative shows about them, they seem to have a warped sense of self-worth, and that they're going to do something in their mind that's going to make them be remembered forever. And one of the things that I think you're going to agree with me on, I don't ever do, is I never mention their real name, because I just don't believe in giving them any publicity whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good practice. In this particular individual, I spent a lot of time researching his life. I mean, actually, we both came from families from hardcore Appalachia, where my parents were from, and 50 miles down the road is where he was born. And we basically grew up in Dayton in a similar way. And the story kind of tracks his life and my life. And somehow, ultimately, we end up together at the scene of a murder in the federal building when he finally consummates his last murder. And there we are face to face after all this time of looking for him.
This is a Law Enforcement Today show. You don't want to miss our conversation with Retired Lieutenant Dan Baker. We're going to talk about investigating and capturing a serial killer that was motivated by racial hatred and many other things. It's all coming your way on the Law Enforcement Today show. We'll be right back.
Are you wondering where you can find more great podcasts? Head to letradioshow.com, click Be Heard, and discover other fantastic podcasts like this one. Also available on our free app, all at letradioshow.com.
Return to our conversation with retired Lieutenant Dan Baker, Dayton, Ohio Police Department, author, and spent many years in homicide. Before we went to break, Dan, you were talking about how this serial killer, the Midnight Slayer, was the nickname he was given, that you and him, you had a lot of parallels in your life, at least from family background, and then you wound up with some sort of meeting or confrontation.
Well, what happened, yes, that's right, John. He had shot over 30 black men literally at random in drive-by style. He had a shotgun that he would just stick out the car window and shoot somebody. And he always did them between midnight and 4 a.m. after he drank a lot and had smoked a little weed. And he was a very plain guy with no other real life. He had a family but was separated and divorced many times from that particular family. And
why am I not surprised?
Yeah, he would just at random, when he felt like it, as he said, on the tape you can listen to, he just got in the car late at night after he got off work and drove across one of the bridges that I previously mentioned into the west side, and just drove up and down the street till he saw someone. Or one night he would shoot 3, some night he would shoot 1, and he would every summer he would do 5 or 6 or 8, whatever happened to be the number for him, and then just drive away. Now, he never came in contact physically with the victim, and of course in the days prior to DNA and the fact he used a shotgun with multiple different kinds of loads, or we didn't have the rifling you get with handguns and those kinds of things. And those low-tech days, it was just a gumshoe investigation. And there was so much misinformation about his description and sometimes the vehicle descriptions that it was very, very difficult to track him down. A lot of things, we went through a lot of the old-fashioned detail in the research for the book and put it in there. For example, you couldn't even run his license plate simply. That was all in printed material you had to get from the Bureau for Motor Vehicles. So it was hard, and the old-fashioned way of relying on informants didn't work with this guy because he was such a loner. He didn't associate with anybody, and he looked like so many other men in the 50s or 60s. Black hair, plastic, black frame glasses. Everybody wore those kind of glasses in those days.
Like the Buddy Holly type glasses, those sort of deals?
Yeah. I mean, he was as plain as he could be. And he painted his car, and he tried to do a couple of other things. What was weird about this guy, though, when we wrote the book, we filed some Freedom of Information reports with the FBI and DOJ, and found out that he had been tracked by the FBI from 1962 to 66 because of some menacing letters he had written regard to Attorney Kennedy about J. Edgar Hoover. However, the police, even
well, that's one way to get the FBI's attention back in the day. I'm no expert in that either, but they were rather protective of that guy.
Right. Well, they certainly didn't pay attention to anything he was doing in our city. In fact, when our police chief, out of so much frustration after a few years, asked the FBI specifically for help, and they said, you know what, you need to rely on your state agencies to help you. And the Civil Rights Division, I have the actual quote in the book, says, you go back to your state civil rights, see if they can help you. So we received zero help. So when he finally shot his last person, he decided to walk into the federal building with a handgun this time and murdered the school desegregation expert in the federal court building. So not only was he a serial killer, he wrapped up his career in that respect.
Did you guys at that point have any idea who it was, or was it still a mystery?
Total mystery, but we had a composite. The composite identikits had been around for a little while, so we had thrown one of those together. And he was so plain, but nevertheless, we did have a composite. So my partner and I happened to be around the corner from the federal building that particular Friday afternoon, and we responded to the scene and ran right up to the scene and up to where he was in the U.S. Marshal's office. The FBI wasn't happy that we had intruded into their sanctum there, but they left because they had asked him only about the federal murder, and they paid no attention to he might even be our guy. It was clear to us he was a very close match, and we had a rights waiver with us. We confiscated a tape recorder off somebody's desk, and he basically said when we walked in the room, we told him we were dating homicide detectives. He said, I know why you're here. So you'll hear on that 13-minute tape a rights waiver, and we had to make a hurry-up press on him to get him to confess to something early, something in the middle, and something toward the end of his shooting spree.
And that takes a lot. That is not a skill set that's easily developed, and quite often for people who watch like Investigation Discovery, my wife and I watch a lot of it. Rod Demery is one of our favorites. Joe Kennan is another one that's a favorite.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and when these guys sit down to interview someone or interrogate someone, they have a game plan already. They've thought it out, and they're very good at what they do. So for you and your partner to all just throw together an interrogation off the cuff, that takes a lot of skill and a lot of experience.
Well, that and a little bit of
luck,
streetwise con stuff, I guess.
Yeah.
The cops learn how to talk to people because you have to. So in the middle of all of this confusion, you hear this quiet explanation of the rights, and we were just chomping at the bit to talk to him but when he signed it, we moved on, and still in monotone tones, he clearly just explains how several nights he just drove by and shot and missed and drove back and tried again, how he killed people. He killed 7 of those 30 that he shot, and he was so monotone about the whole thing. And then when the FBI comes in 14 minutes later, they were shocked to see us in the U.S. Marshal's cell with a tape recorder.
I'll bet.
That wasn't happy for them. But we moved on, and we kept the tape, and we built all of our cases. So
that's pretty amazing.
Quite an exciting time.
It's pretty amazing because, and you can fill the gaps for this one, investigating homicides most often, and I don't know what the percentage is, most often the person who kills someone else is someone that is closely connected to the other person, a family member, a relative, spouse,
Correct.
Boyfriend, girlfriend. There's a connection. So when you find out who the victim is, you start looking at who they know, who's last to see them, and then you start getting into all the technical things they have nowadays that we didn't have back in the day. But when you have a serial killer and it's a total stranger shooting and killing total strangers with something as innocuous as a shotgun, that's like having a major red ball. How do you begin to solve that one?
Well, we went through a lot of effort, but again, in the low-tech days, everything was manual. For example, we sent someone up to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles in Columbus, Ohio. Based on the make of car we had often seen at most of these shootings, and came back with all of the makes of cars for a 3-county area with our county and around us. And we had over 1,000 of those makes in that particular year range. And we just started going back trying to find those cars in our spare time in the evenings, working overtime and other times. and we pulled in many other detectives to help. So it was a long, wild thing. That was one crazy thing that we tried. And of course, you would track down one car and find out it had been traded 3 times. So
there you
that
go.
easy.
We're going to take a short break. We are talking with retired Lieutenant Dan Baker. We're talking about homicide investigation. We're talking in particular about the investigation and apprehension of the Midnight Slayer. This is a Law Enforcement Today show. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
The Officer Down Memorial Podcast tells the real stories of the men and women we've lost in the line of duty.
It is one of the darkest days in Itasca County's history.
From the officers who were there.
He's probably maybe one of the best investigators and a natural born one.
And family and friends who were left behind.
You try and get distance from people's tragedies, but the death of Beefy, it just shot home to all of us how permanent murder is.
You can subscribe to the Officer Down Memorial Podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts.
If you've missed past episodes of the Law Enforcement Today show, never fear. You can listen to them online. Just go to our website, lawenforcementtoday.com, or download our free app, also available on our website. That's lawenforcementtoday.com. Returning our conversation with retired Lieutenant Dan Baker from Dayton, Ohio Police Department, also author, and we're talking about investigating this serial killer known as, or called, the Midnight Slayer. And to recap for those who are just tuning in, back in the 60s and 70s, this man shot 30 men and killed 7 of them, and it was motivated by racial hatred and really instigated by what was happening back then with desegregation. And in their minds, these killers, it makes sense to them why they do this. And I think everybody else's mind, even particularly the homicide investigators, you're probably thinking, this is not logical at all. It makes no sense whatsoever.
No, and just a quick story about how he did it. He walks into the federal building, which in 1975 wasn't necessarily highly secure, but the security guard just motioned him around the table since he didn't carry anything. And he asked where Dr. Glatt's office was, who the expert. And the guy just directs him around because it's like 4:30 in the afternoon on a Friday. And he goes down the hallways looking for this man's name. And he sees Dr. Glatt sitting in an office with an open door with a secretary taking dictation. And this particular Midnight Slayer suspect says in a very calm voice, "Are you Dr. Glatt?" And Dr. Glatt spins around in his chair and says, "Why, yes, I am." And he says, "God told me to kill you." And he fired 6 shots, neck, head, upper torso. And Glatt died before he got to the hospital.
It's horrifying. It's horrifying to hear that. And the guy's just sitting there doing his job.
Right.
That's what he was doing, just a man doing his job.
He'd only been there a month, and things had triggered so much to where this particular killer just decided to go step on the lion's tail straight into the federal building. And fortunately, he was apprehended as he left. And of course, Dr. Glatt never was able to speak again after that, and he's passed away right away. So this particular killer was determined to be sane to stand trial. He had 5 psychiatric examinations. 3 of the 5 said he was sufficient to stand trial. And he ultimately pled guilty on all these multiple charges of state and federal. Since federal had him in basic custody from the beginning of the arrest, he served all of his time in federal prisons and died in the 90s.
Well, I'm not sorry to hear he died. I'm sorry that to hear that he got to live so many years in incarceration. And
he did.
And that has always bothered me. And I don't want to get into a debate about capital punishment, but one of the things that just annoys me to no end, Dan, and I'm sure you'll agree, people say, well, they'll never see the light of day again. I said, well, guess what? What about these lifers who have nothing to lose, that are murderers? And what about the corrections officers that got to work around them every day? What about the nurses that have to come in there and work? What about the social workers and the teachers? And what about the young kid who gets locked up for something? It's got to be his cellmate. Yeah, just because he's incarcerated doesn't mean he can't pose a risk to other people. Absolutely.
Well, the legacy of this kind of guy almost gets validated sometimes, that he kills and he doesn't pay the ultimate price. And it may send the wrong message to some people, and especially twisted minds who think, well, this guy didn't get the death penalty. I mean, I'm moving on. Not that they think clearly.
No, they don't think logically, but they also, many of them tend to think, I'm going to be famous and I'll be known. In their marginalized life where they'll accomplish nothing, they'll never be known for anything. This is their way of getting some notoriety and, in their mind, becoming famous. And that was the case with the guy in South Carolina who was racially motivated, murdering those people at church. I won't give his name. There are other people. And even back as far as Charles Manson with his wanted to create a race war based off murder. These cats are out of their gourds. They make no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, and I often wondered if this particular individual thought that others may sympathize with him. But he was so low key and so shy and so understated. He's like the person that can work at a job. He worked at gas stations a lot of the time. He's hardly remembered by anybody. He was just there, kind of like a person inside of a shadow or something. And he had no connections to the outside, and had a great deal of trouble, sadly, with his children, who, by the way, most turned out very well.
I'm glad to hear that. I was going to ask how the kids were.
Well, it's funny. 6 months ago, my wife and I were at a restaurant, and someone called our names out. And it was one of his sons. He'd read the book.
No kidding.
And he walked up to my wife and says, and called her by name because he recognized her picture from the back of the book. And he says, I want to thank you for what you did. He said, my dad was a monster.
Yeah. That's probably the best explanation you can come up with. It makes no sense, whatever. Yeah. And I'm sitting here thinking, we talked about how much harder it is to investigate serial killers where there's no connection between the killer and the victim. And when the only connection between the different victims is that they're all male and they're all the same race, that's going to make it even harder.
It did, because plus it adds such a fear factor to the killings. And he was totally indiscriminate about where he shot his victims. He shot a preacher coming out of a church. And he shot young people, no children, no teenagers. And just people out doing a job, a guy delivering papers or a guy at a gas station. Wherever he chose, his victim looked like prey that was visible. He just did it. He just acted.
So if he saw the opportunity, that's when he reacted and he just did it.
He just did it.
There's no, other than his hatred, there was no other motivating factor. There's nothing in there. What I'm getting at is like with the Beltway snipers, this guy was doing this to cover up wanting to kill his ex-wife. And he was randomly picking out people of every race, walk, sex, gender, didn't matter. Your killer was picking people of same race and same gender.
Yeah, the only thing that I came across that was kind of unusual, he may have had some race confusion of his own, because when he died in prison, he had his race changed to say white Hispanic. Or Hispanic, I'm sorry.
Okay.
And I heard from a family member earlier that it's possible he was part Indian, supposedly. So maybe he had some race confusion in his life, but I don't think so. I think it was driven by some of the hatred he grew up around in the hardcore Appalachia, and then he was ill-equipped to come here. Most of his family was illiterate. He had gone to 7th grade, so he could read, and everybody came to him for their mail. He couldn't even, he helped the whole family. And I think it just become a burden to this guy, and he had menial jobs he couldn't hold, and he just never was able to succeed at anything.
And the victims' families, those that survived and those who did not, was there anything you took away from your memories of dealing with them that stood out? Well,
just the overwhelming unpredictability and sadness associated. And when I saw it most profound is when we finally did the lineups of the Midnight Slayer along with some other people to have him picked out from an identification standpoint, standing on a stage. We would have groups of people in. And to see that many people in groups of 3, 10 here, 10 there, all with the same thing happening to their lives with their family member, brought together by this guy up on the stage. it was unbelievable because these people did not know each other, and they're here to pick out the guy.
And unfortunately, their common denominators are linked by violence and death for some and horrific injuries for others, and based solely on how they looked. This is the Law Enforcement Today show. We are talking with retired Police Lieutenant Dan Baker, also author of the book Blood in the Streets, I believe is the name of the book. We'll talk more about the book. We'll talk more about the investigation and capture of the serial killer known as the Midnight Slayer in just a few moments. This is Law Enforcement Today show. We'll be right back.
Miss an episode of Law Enforcement Today? You don't have to anymore, because now you can listen to it on Podopolo, the free new app that makes listening anytime, anywhere so easy. Catch up on shows you've missed and chat with John J. Wiley right there too. Download for free on the Apple or Google Play stores. That's Podopolo. And John J. Wiley wants to hear from you inside Podopolo.
If you've missed past episodes of the Law Enforcement Today show, never fear. You can listen to them online. Just go to our website, lawenforcementtoday.com, or download our free app, also available on our website. That's lawenforcementtoday.com. Back to our conversation with retired Lieutenant Dan Baker on the Law Enforcement Today show. We worked homicide for many years in Dayton, Ohio. We're talking about the investigation and apprehension of the serial killer known as the Midnight Slayer. There's other ones we could talk about, Dan. We'll have to have you back in the future to talk more about those. One of the things that, thanks to television, all these CSI shows and everything else, is people tend to think that A, murders are solved in an hour, and B, that every murder has physical evidence like DNA and fingerprints and blood matches and all these things. And the truth is, many don't. I can tell you the amount of times that I've had fingerprints were taken off of a gun that a murderer used, and that amounts to zero. I've had one come off of a piece of ammunition, brass. It's very rare.
Yes, and it's absolutely correct, and it's not all as it seems in a 1 hour show. During my second career, I actually was the executive director of the Law Enforcement Innovation Center and the National Forensic Academy at the University of Tennessee in the late mid-2000s. And I was really, really fully introduced to forensic evidence and the kind of programming we did there. It would have been a dream to have that, but even in my day, but even with all the wonderful things you have from technology today and chemical analysis, et cetera, you still have to have someone that can put the daggone case together.
Right.
And and when you're dealing with human beings, you need trained investigators that know how to relate to people, how to manage a significant case, manage all the physical evidence, as well as the investigative aspect of it. I know in my case, we didn't have a lot of physical evidence and laboratory stuff to deal with because it didn't exist.
Right.
So we were the old style gumshoe cops.
And that's kind of where I came from. That was it solved by lots and lots of legwork, knocking on doors and talking to people. We used to always say cases weren't solved from inside the building; they were solved on the streets.
That's right. And I would imagine our careers mirrored one another in the fact that informants, in many cases, whether it be a relative or whether it be a dope dealer informant, you had to still use a lot of the same skills to get that someone trusting enough of you to talk to you.
Right.
And just, it didn't matter what it was. We tried to employ pretty much the same tactics over and over. And that's about relating to people, even people that you may not prefer to relate to, but you do because that's what you need to do to solve the crime.
You had to. Police cases aren't made by talking to altar boys. They are made by talking with people who, some of them they're drug addicted. If it wasn't for drug addiction or alcoholism or other things, they would never be in trouble a day in their life. And then there's other ones who are just career criminals. But they can all be good sources of information. And one of the best sources of information during my career were prostitutes, because they were always on the street and they saw everything. They didn't miss a lick.
You know, that goes back to a really old saying in the Fundamentals of Criminal Investigation. One of the first investigation book I ever read in the 60s, on the front page it said in French, "Chaser les femmes," seek the women. Understand that women are often in the hardcore criminal cases with drugs and or some sort of organized crime or whatever, the woman will often have the inside story on what's really going on with the participants in the criminal enterprise. But in general, you're right. Prostitutes, especially in my day when there was a lot of that active on the street, it was important because even though they may be out there for their single purpose, they hear more than I could ever dream of hearing.
Yeah, and if they saw it, it all depended on how you treated them. One of the things that used to always drill into my head as a young police was you treat everybody with respect until they change the tone of the conversation. And that was like rule number one, especially when you're dealing with people who work the streets that lived a dangerous lifestyle because, A, they can provide useful information to you, and B, sometimes your life might depend on them coming to help you.
Absolutely. It's happened in both cases for me. That's for darn sure.
I've had streetwalkers that turned out, most of them were men dressed as women. Most of the prostitutes are male. And people sometimes think just because that's the case that they can't fight. Well, I'm here to tell you. Thank goodness they could because they saved my life.
Yeah, and carry some weapons too. Right?
Yes, they do. Now, speaking of weapons, this man's weapon of choice until the end was a shotgun. That poses a lot of difficulties for investigators. If you don't have spent brass or shotgun rounds, you've got very little physical evidence to go against.
Yeah, that's what happened with the Midnight Slayer. I mean, we might find a shell casing because sometimes you'd fire multiple shots, but again, you're not going to get that much out of that. And even finding the wadding inside of a victim's chest may or may not provide any real help because you still don't have a lot of the really good forensic out of that.
No, and most of that shotgun weapon, especially using mixed loads, different kinds of loads, you could buy them at sporting goods stores. You could buy them back in the day when Sears was available, Walmart. 12-gauge shotgun rounds are everywhere.
Right. Yeah, you hear all the issues about gun control and things like that today, and the federal forms we use to legally buy firearms. And the Midnight Slayer bought a new shotgun when he finally wore his other one out. And, of course, he lied all over the form. And, of course, in those days, it was all handled by paper and pickups once a week by AT&F at the dealers. There was no computerization of the record. So it was just there. I just discovered it later on.
And when there's no one would have known. Was there anything that he may have left breadcrumbs or there was moments later on you go, oh, if we'd only picked up on that, we'd have had him much earlier?
No, we went backwards and could not find any noticeable missed lead. We all believed that. In fact, I didn't realize how much had happened prior to his time until we started digging back through the book and what went on during the riots and how all this built up. And I didn't realize the role of the FBI, of course. And in the early days of the investigation of the Midnight Slayer, some leads were probably nothing seemed to exist when it comes to that.
Yeah, and one of the reasons you go back and look is that's how we learn to get better at our job, and people that follow us learn from what we do and say, oh, here's something we should have noticed or could have noticed. We need to pay attention to that in the future. But there was none of that going on. No,
and the usual thing happens, and we still see today. Even when we went back and talked to his former employers after he murdered Dr. Glatt, they said, well, he was a pretty dependable guy. He was always here, and he never caused a problem, and he was just always quiet. He seemed okay to us.
Yeah, never. Well, they always say, I never saw any signs that indicate he'd go off. He was such a good kid, such a good guy. Then there's other ones that go, this guy was a ticking time bomb, and you asking yourself, why didn't you say something?
Yeah.
But there was none of that with this guy.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people might be reluctant to say, yeah, I really noticed it and blew it. I don't think many people want to admit that.
Is there something that we can learn from investigating Midnight Slayer that will apply that other investigators on the job now can use, or even people listening say, hey, you need to be on the lookout for these sorts of behaviors?
Being the best student you can be of human behavior, especially when you're dealing with witnesses and complainants and informants, the better you can be at understanding human behavior and trying to determine the veracity of a particular person you're dealing with. Cops are good at that almost naturally after a few years on the street, but you can actually hone those skills even more. And detectives like my friend Doyle Burke, and many of the others I was blessed to work with over many, many years. Just terrific cops. They had that particular skill. And the other thing I always saw in the crew that I had that I loved the most, they never gave up. They never gave up. I don't care if they were hunting hobos along the railroad. They would go 100 miles to try to interview every daggone hobo they could find.
And that's the way it was with the people I worked with. They literally were dogs with a bone. They're not giving it up. It doesn't mean they solved every case, but they certainly tried. They put in every effort they could. Before we wrap it up, again, give the title of the book and where people can get more information and purchase the book.
It's called Blood in the Streets, Racism, Riots, and Murders in the Heartland of America. And you can get it at Amazon.com and just about any book outlet there is.
And now that's written by you and your wife.
Right.
That sounds like a topic for a radio show in the future.
Okay, well, be glad to do that.
Yeah, have her come on and... that's a segment that people really don't get to hear about. Rarely you get to hear from law enforcement people beyond the quotes in the newspaper, but we almost never hear from their spouses what it was like to deal with someone, especially when they worked homicide for many years and all that entails. So please tell her I said thank you and or invite her to come on the show sometime in the future.
All right, thank you, John.
Dan Baker, thanks so much for being a guest on the Law Enforcement Today show. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank our guests so much for coming on the Law Enforcement Today radio show. The Law Enforcement Today radio show is a nationally syndicated radio show broadcast on numerous stations once a week and growing. If you enjoyed the podcast version of the show, please do me a big favor. Tell a friend. I'll be back in just a couple days with a brand new episode of the Law Enforcement Today radio show and podcast. Until then, this is John J. Wiley. See ya.